Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is a few CSS declarations that have viewport-related problems on mobile. What you're seeing here is my position fixed test page. And position fixed on mobile has gone through a lot of iterations. And they are now stabilizing to what I consider the correct implementation of position fixed on mobile. First of all, the specification says that any fixed item will be fixed relative to the viewport, which is good to know, except that it doesn't tell us which viewport. This is something you will encounter a lot in the CSS specifications, as well as in a lot of articles you will read. Somebody will talk about the viewport, but will not tell you which one they mean. In the case of position fixed, it's fairly clear that they mean the visual viewport. Because the whole idea of position fixed is that something stays at the same place on the page, no matter how much the user is scrolling. And I should not forget to turn on my recording. I'm going to do that now, recording on. So it's fairly clear, you know, this is fixed relative to the visual viewport and should be the same on mobile. However, there's a technical problem here. What we have here is a way of scrolling most of the page, but not all of it, which means that the browser itself has to form a certain layer that either scrolls by itself or stays fixed by itself. Now that's not impossible, but again it takes a lot of resources on the browser because you now have several elements on the page that can scroll independently of each other. And this is one of the reasons why it took quite a while for position fixed to really land on mobile. And the only browser that really supports it well right now is Chrome. Chrome does what we expect from position fixed. Because there's a second problem with the specification. It does not tell you what should happen when the user zooms. Zoom is not much of an issue on desktop, but it happens all the time on mobile. And that is the problem where the problem is, okay, what should you do with the fixed layer when the user zooms? And different browsers have come to different conclusions. There's a lot of old browsers that said, okay, we're going to fix it relative to the viewport, and we choose to interpret viewport as the layout viewport. And that effectively means that the fixed element scrolls with the page, right? Because when you scroll on mobile, you are moving the page through the layout viewport. If the fixed element stays relative to the layout viewport, it's the same as if it would have position absolute, if you know what I mean. You can see that at the bottom of my test page. No, you cannot. Where's it gone? I had a comparison layer here. Well, it doesn't really matter because that's the wrong way of implementing position fixed. The right way of implementing position fixed, you can see that if you open this page on Chrome, because Chrome does it right. Most other browsers nowadays are converging on what Chrome is doing. It's a pity I can't show it on screen, but the basic idea is that first of all, of course, the layer stays fixed. Secondly, note that I gave the layer a width of 50%, and that's interpreted as 50% of the visual viewport. So if you zoom in and the visual viewport becomes smaller because the CSS pixels grow, then the fixed element will also become smaller and the text will become larger and larger. I'll see if I can fake that on desktop, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, it's about like on desktop. You know, this is what is supposed to be happening on mobile as well. You see that the fixed element becomes smaller in terms of CSS pixels. It takes less and less CSS pixels, but because we zoom in at the same time, it takes on the same part of the screen, 50%. And the text grows and eventually flows out of the element. Now this, how useful is this on mobile? To be honest, I'm not convinced that position fixed should be used a lot on mobile, because first of all you have the desktop position fixed, which is usually for like small bars with extra functionality, you know, a tweet button and a Facebook button and this and that, and it's not all that important content. So why bother the mobile screen with it, especially when you realize that the fixed layer takes a lot more of the mobile screen than it does of the desktop screen. I mean, if you have a fixed layer of, I don't know, 50 pixels high, that's a fairly small bar on the desktop, but a lot more on mobile. So we should not burden the mobile display, the tiny mobile display, with a lot of stuff that's not really very important. And that's one of the reasons I tend to dislike a lot of use of position fixed on mobile. The other way around would be to say, okay, I've got these few buttons on my site that are really, really important because they have core functions. And I want the user to be able to continually use them. So that would be kind of a good way of implementing position fixed on mobile, because it's really an important site functionality. However, that is something you rarely see on desktop. So what we're seeing here is that the use cases for position fixed on desktop and mobile are diverging. On desktop it's generally used for not all that terribly important content, while on mobile, if you use it and if you take up 10, 20, maybe even 30% of the small screen by one single layer that stays in view all the time, your content would better be very important. So apart from the technical problems in the implementation of position fixed, I'm questioning the need for position fixed on mobile. Now a funny thing happened. Years ago, I was thinking about position fixed on mobile for the first time, and I thought, yeah, you know what we should have is like a fixed layer, just like here, but the text size should stay the same even when the user zooms. Because if you consider, let's say we have a really important functionality that has to be on the mobile screen all the time, and let's say it's 3 links, something like that. I don't know, home, login, and something else, whatever, doesn't matter. So you have 3 links in the fixed bar that are available all the time. Then the user starts to zoom in, and the text of those links will grow, but that's not actually necessary, because the default text of those links should be large enough to show on the mobile screen, especially if you've properly used responsive design. So I said what we need is something that I call position device fixed, which is like fixed in all respects, except that the font size always stays the same relative to the screen. In other words, if you zoom in, this text becomes larger and this text stays the same. That was my idea 3 years ago. Last week I was at Microsoft and they told me, hey, yeah, we implemented that. So in IE11 we now actually have position -ms-device fixed, and it does what I want, which is totally cool. I mean, I haven't played around with it a lot yet because I haven't had time on this trip. But once I get home, I will try to figure out how useful that is going to be. And it could be that it's even more useful than regular position fixed. Again, because of the problem of the font size. As far as I'm concerned, the font size should not grow when the user zooms in. It depends on your use case, of course. One browser that has a weird implementation of position fixed is Safari. Don't know if you ever played around with position fixed on Safari, but it has a kind of a parallax scrolling that to me personally doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it's also the only browser to have that. What it does is if I scroll up, I have to say this right, I think this layer also scrolls up, but slower than the rate of the page as a whole. And if you ask me why did they do that, I have no clue. This is once again the Safari team solving imaginary problems or something like that. So be aware that position fixed may not work all that well in Safari, especially when you zoom. Okay, so that's what I had to say about position fixed. How many of you have actually used position fixed on a mobile website? Did it work out like you wanted to?
No, it didn't work out.
Okay.
Especially if there's an input text field.
Huh.
Change the orientation.
Oh yeah. That's something else. I mean, what should happen when the orientation changes? I mean, it should adapt to the new visual viewport, as far as I'm concerned, but that may have unintended side effects. So be very careful when using position fixed on mobile, and make absolutely sure that you test it in a lot of browsers and that the whole effect actually makes sense to the user and to yourself. Let's go to another interesting CSS property, the VW and VH units. Yes?
Any other notes like this on other types of positioning elements, like absolute, static, relative, or they're okay?
Yeah, they're okay, they're fine. Yeah, because they have nothing to do with the viewports. They're just relative to the page, which you can scroll up and down. So static, relative, and absolute can be used as usual. The VW and VH units. VW is viewport width, VH is viewport height. In theory, what you're saying here is if you say 10 VW, that means 10% of the width of the viewport. And you can use this for widths and heights. And now that seems pretty interesting. The problem, again, is relative to which viewport. Browsers were confused about this. I'm going again with the Chrome team here that says it should be relative to the layout viewport. Because if it were relative to the layout, to the visual viewport, as it actually is on BlackBerry and a few other browsers, then if you use these units, the elements would constantly resize themselves, you know, to stay at 50% of the visual viewport width when you zoom in or out. And again, that puts a lot of stress on the browser and on the memory. And it's not all that useful. So what we're seeing on mobile is that the VW and VH units are relative to the layout viewport. And that actually might make sense, because if you have a proper responsive design, and you say, okay, I want to divide the page vertically into 3, you give all elements 33 VH as a height, which means basically 33% of the viewport height. That could work. That could be interesting. The problem again is Safari. I'm not totally sure what's going on, but at least some of the time these two units are calculated relative not to the layout viewport, but to the HTML element, which is not a viewport at all. Okay, so this entire page is an HTML element, right? It's wrapped in an HTML element. The browser window is the viewport, as we've seen, but the HTML element, because there's a lot more content in it, is a lot longer than the viewport. This is usually the case in web pages, right? That the HTML element stretches up in order to accommodate all of the content you put into it. That is normal standard CSS. If Safari does this wrong, and I have to retest it because I'm not 100% sure of my conclusion, but if Safari calculates the VW and VH relative to the HTML element, that would mean that if you would say 33 VH on this page, that it would take 33% not of the viewport, but of the total width, height of the HTML element, which is this. And it gets really funny when you add content to the HTML. If you add an extra paragraph or an extra button or an extra image, the HTML element stretches up, and the elements with VW or VH units also stretch up because the size of the HTML element has changed. So again, in theory, this is pretty interesting for mobile, especially in combination with proper responsive designs, but in practice you will have severe problems in Safari. Not in the other browsers. Most of the other browsers do it right. Most of the other browsers do it relative to the layout viewport as it should be. Some do it relative to the visual viewport, but I think they will change over. But what Safari is doing, I have, again, no clue. The problem is that the Safari team is never talking to anyone. that leaves us guessing, and that leaves us basically reverse engineering the entire browser to see what they're up to. And sometimes it's just incomprehensible. So I hope that these two examples have shown you that it's sometimes important to stop and ask yourself, okay, which viewport is meant here? Because there's hardly anyone yet who is very specific and precise in saying which viewport they actually mean. Especially, of course, in older CSS specifications. That makes sense, because back before 2006, the 3 viewports didn't exist yet. So spec writers from that day and age didn't know they had several viewports. They would have several viewports later on. But especially in recent CSS specifications, it's becoming kind of annoying that they just don't pay any attention to the mobile viewports at all. Still, most of the time you can make a pretty accurate guess relative to which viewport something should be. So again, this is something to think about. We may find future bugs in other CSS declarations that are relative to some kind of a viewport, but I'm not sure. We'll see. So that's what I wanted to say about position fixed and the VW and VH units. Are there any questions? Yes.
You said sometimes in support
In my tests, it always happens. It's always relative to the HTML element. But I recently heard a report from somebody who said, no, it's not always the case. It's just sometimes. And I have to figure that out, because sometimes it's even worse than always. If a browser always has a bug, okay, you can work around it. But if it has a bug only sometimes, then you're really into problems. So I'm hoping to do additional testing on that. Any more questions? No? Okay. Then, let me quickly check. Okay, so, come on. I have talked about position fixed now. I promised to talk a little bit about typography. I think we did that just before the official class started this morning. So let's do that as well. I don't know a lot about typography, first of all, but what I do know is that mobile browsers tend to do weird stuff with font sizes. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but I've got a few unstyled test pages that just don't have a font size at all. There is a paragraph and an ally below it, and they have a completely different font size. Well, in theory, that should not happen. Browsers are trying to optimize the font size according to some arcane algorithm hidden deep inside them, but it's not very successful. This is actually something I have decided to investigate deeper, I hope in fall, because the problem I'm having here is that in order to accurately measure a font size in the browser, I must have a way of measuring it. And just asking for the style is not enough, because every single browser will tell you, yeah, my default font size is 16 pixels, whatever the situation. And that is just not true in practice. So I need to figure out a way of correctly measuring a font size. That is, having a test sentence and measuring how wide it is, and that should say something useful about the font size. Turns out that technically this is very tricky. Fortunately, I'm going to have some help from the guys at Typekit, who are also interested in this problem, and we may have found a solution for the measurement problem. Yeah, there was a question.
Well, there's also a relation between font size and the font type, right?
What font?
Not all fonts. Because not all fonts have the same size, right?
Yeah, that is very tricky. Yes, that is correct. Not all fonts have the same size. That is because actual glyphs in a font have a defined width, and that is defined as either 1,000th part of an EM box or 1/2048th part or something. I'm not too clear on the details. It was very complicated in any way, but you cannot assume that, for instance, the letter E will have the same size in each font, even if you specify the same font size. So yes, that is definitely a problem, which is why we probably are going to use a custom type that's created specifically just for these tests. So we can figure out, okay, it should be this long, and is it actually that long? So that's probably going to be the solution. But typography is a really tricky topic that I don't know too much about. I mean, I've mainly talked about problems right now and not solutions. In any case, and of course there's a related question, what about web fonts? What's when you download a font? I mean, I have to test in which browsers it works, of course. I don't know yet. I think it's pretty well supported, but that's purely a guess. So please test it yourself if you want to use it. And the second problem is, of course, the whole thing about asset management. That is, ideally, we want to have the web font in place at the moment we start to render the page, but that's not possible because we first start to download the page, then find a reference to a web font, then start to download the font, and that usually takes a little while before the font is downloaded completely and we can render the page with that font. Actually, this problem is vaguely related to responsive images in the sense that we need stricter control over the order of downloading of our assets. And assets being defined as basically anything that can be in an HTML page. And this is something that hasn't got a lot of attention yet, mostly because it's really tricky to do. Because, you know, suppose I do a lot of tests and create an ideal order of downloading assets. If there's one server that has a hiccup and that doesn't respond for half a second, that order may be completely off and the page will not load properly. So this is an extremely complicated subject. I'm not going to go deeper into it, mostly because I don't have an easy solution. But it's again something we should think about. How are we, what is the ideal order of downloading assets and how are we going to enforce that order? And in both cases, my current answer is I don't know. So I want to leave it at that for typography, to be honest, because I don't have a lot more to say.
Is there any browser that handles it better than any other?
I don't know yet. I don't know. That's why I want to do some testing before I answer that question. I guess the answer will be yes, but I don't know which browser yet. I already talked about breakpoints. Breakpoints should be whatever your design needs. It should be your design that's leading for the breakpoints and not browsers or devices. Which brings us to our next major topic, touch and pointer events. I gave this presentation that you're about to see in February in London. Again, last week I visited Microsoft and I got a lot of new information about the pointer events. I will talk about that, but I don't have slides on everything yet. So you will have to make some notes here. But touch events are, of course, next to viewports, the most important thing that's different on mobile than on desktop. I mean, a touch-based interface is just slightly different from a mouse-based interface. And the question how much of a difference there is an interesting one, because sometimes there's not much of a difference. For instance, consider drag and drop. I mean, drag and drop with the mouse is traditionally mouse down, take it, mouse move, move it, mouse up, release it. And with touch, it's of course touch start, touch move, touch end. It's just exactly the same on mouse and on touch. But if on the other hand you take a drop-down menu, it works completely differently because it's with mouse over and mouse out, which don't really have an equivalent on touch. I'm going to get to that in my presentation. But I'm also going to try to make a philosophical argument about how we should view the various interaction modes, as I call them. So, the touch events. First of all, which touch events are there? These. Touch start, touch move, touch end, and touch cancel. These events do not work in IE. IE has the separate pointer events. We're going to get back to those later, but all other browsers support these, except of course for the proxy browsers. right? Because if a proxy browser would support these events, it has to go back to the server to ask for instruction every time you touch the screen, and that's not what we want. Okay, so touch starts is the user starts touching the screen, touch move is the user moves, touch ends is the the user releases the screen. That's easy. Then we have touch cancel, which is vague. It's supposed to mean something like the operating system has decided that the whole touch event sequence should be cancelled. For instance, Chrome fires a touch cancel event when your finger leaves the screen altogether, but most other browsers don't. This is highly browser dependent, and I've never found a serious use for touch cancel, so I'm not going to talk about it, and I suggest that you don't worry about it too much. Touch start, touch move, and touch end are important. Oh yeah, I created example pages. Quirksmode.org/touch events contains links to various test files that I will refer to in the site later. Nobody of you had a Windows phone, right? I do. You do. Okay, then I have a second one. I'll get it out because later in this presentation there are a few test files that are IE only. And it will be useful to show them.
Do you care about a Windows tablet?
Would be interesting to try. Sure, let's try it. I must admit, yeah, it works. I mean, kind of. Oh. Oh, you are annoying. Oh yeah. Anyway, my first and most fundamental rule is stick with click. In other words, if you can get away with just using the click event, do it. Because the click event is 100% safe. Because despite its name, click is not a mouse event. Click is not exclusive to the mouse. It was created together with the mouse events when nobody could yet envision JavaScript events without the mouse, so they called it click. But it really should have been called activate, because it fires always, in all circumstances, in all interaction modes, in all browsers, when, and this is vague, you use an element for its intended purpose. In other words, you follow a link, you click on a button, you submit a form, that kind of stuff. Browsers have made very sure that it always fires in these circumstances. So, in addition, it will continue to work forever because of backwards compatibility. A new browser, suppose we get new browsers on TVs or in cars or whatever, they cannot afford not to support the click events because too many sites depend on it. So if the interaction on your site is relatively simple and you just need a click event, do it. You are 100% safe. However, there's a catch. If you've ever actually used the click event, or if you've just clicked a link, you will have noticed that there's a tiny delay of about 300 milliseconds between you touching the screen and the click event or the link following actually taking place. Why is that? It all comes down to the question, what does touching the screen mean? At the very instant the user's finger touches the screen, the browser and the operating system have no clue yet what's going to happen. Will it be a single tap or a scroll? Or will it be part of a pinch zoom? Or will it be a double tap? That means zoom. They don't know yet. Oh, yeah, there they all come. the OS needs to wait a little while to figure out what you mean. This especially goes for double tap. Double tap is the real culprit here, because you could say, okay, touch start, touch end, in quick succession means a tap, which means I should follow the link or submit the form or do whatever. But it could be that the user actually wants to double tap. So the browser has to wait a little while to make sure that there's no second tap coming. And that's the reason of the delay. How do you get around this? The first solution, which I do not recommend, is turning off zooming. Double tap is just for zooming. If you turn off zooming, double tapping makes no sense and the delay is removed. However, you should never remove zooming capabilities from your website. So what the Chrome team is now doing is conducting an interesting experiment. The reason is as follows. If a page uses width equals device width, ideal viewport in other cases, then the web developer probably knows what he or she is doing, and the website will probably be properly responsive, and it's likely that the user will not have to zoom. This is a guess, but an interesting one. So we say, if a page uses width equals device width, we turn off the delay. And that means that you cannot double tap anymore, but in theory it should not be necessary. Again, I'm emphasizing that it is an experiment. It could be that Chrome turns out to be wrong in this, but I think it's the most worthwhile experiment so far. I mean, so far the only other solution was to entirely disable zooming, and I don't like that at all. So let's see what happens here before we judge any further. There's also all kinds of complicated and weird browser incompatibilities with when exactly do browsers suppress the delay. I'm not going to go into them, mostly because I don't know them by heart. They're all on my site. Okay, let's talk about the event cascade, because we have a problem here. Many sites depend on click, and click works as intended on mobile, on touchscreens. And many other sites depend on mouse events. Mouse down, mouse up, mouse move, mouse over, mouse out. It's weird to fire mouse events on a device that doesn't actually have a mouse, but it's necessary. You have to be able to fire mouse events because too many websites depend on them. So, what happens in practice when you tap one single time is an event cascade. That means the browser fires a lot of events. Touch start and touch end, obviously, but more than that. The type 1 event cascade is any action but a single tap. So for instance, scrolling or pinch zooming or stuff like that. What the browser does is fire touch start, touch move, touch end, and possibly, but not in all browsers, an event like scroll or resize. Although scroll and resize are both not perfectly supported. Resize especially is a mess. So far, this makes pretty decent sense, right? We monitor what the user is actually doing on the screen with the touch events, which makes sense. And then the result of the user action gives rise to yet another event. This is simple. It's a type 2 event cascade that's complicated. That's a single tap. I do this, and the following events fire. So what's basically going on is that all mouse events are fired after the touch end. Then follows the click, and then the hover styles are applied. And the delay is roughly here between touch end and the rest, though that may differ a little bit per browser. This exact order of events is not set in stone. Android WebKit, the old Android default browser in particular, moves the mouse over and move to above the touch start. And other browsers have other minor variations, but don't worry about that too much. Because in general, you use either pure touch events, you're listening for touch start and touch end, which work absolutely fine, or you're listening to one of these events, but not more. In general, most websites just listen to one of these events, and the event will fire eventually. Yes?
So if you're on an iOS device and you have a flyout menu on the hover, CSS hover rule, for example, if you tap it once, the click, I don't think it's triggered.
That is correct. I'm coming to that later.
Okay.
Yes. Basically, CSS only hover styles do not work on Safari iOS. Unless you add some JavaScript.
I think they do, right? So if
Well, they're sticky.
so right, but if the result of a click action on whatever you tap on would do something, I think
Yes.
it's a click and registered or if it's a link.
Basically, yes. Basically, you have to register a click event or a mouse event, I think, on the thing you want to click on. And then it works,
Right. Okay.
as far as I know. And that's weird because the event handler can actually be an empty function. So yeah, we're coming to the Safari weirdnesses. But in any case, you generally use only one of these 5 events and it will fire and you will be safe. But we're not done yet. We have now clicked on a certain element and all this stuff happens. Then you you tap on another element, and on the original element the mouse out event fires and the hover styles are removed. And why is that? We will see either in the next slides or shortly. Yeah, here we go. The first test is a drop-down menu, and the drop-down menu 1, you can load it on your phones now, and your task is to click on option 3.2. This drop-down menu is with pure mouse events. There are no touch events involved whatsoever, and you will find that it kind of works. It's a bit weird maybe if you're used to pure drop-down menus from the desktop, but it works.
These are JavaScript driven?
Yeah, it's JavaScript, yes. Yes, because drop-down menus, there are so many drop-down menus on the web. So when Apple started to develop Safari for iOS, they had to make sure that all these drop-downs were triggered. And drop-downs traditionally work with mouse over and mouse out, which is one of the main reasons why mobile browsers still must support the mouse events, even though it doesn't make sense on a device without a mouse. So what's happening here is you tap on a certain link. Eventually in the cascade the mouse over event fires and the menu folds out. Then you tap somewhere else, and that's not part of that link, and then the mouse out event fires on the link itself and closes the drop-down menu again. Again, this specific implementation is mostly about drop-down menus, because drop-down menus are the most ubiquitous use of mouse over and mouse out on the web. But it works in other situations as well. Now, this is a complicated Safari-only rule. If a content change occurs on mouse over or on mouse move, the rest of the cascade is cancelled. 2 questions here: why on mouse over and on mouse move? And what's a content change? On mouse over, I can kind of imagine, again for drop-down menus, suppose that the topmost level of a drop-down menu consists of links. You tap on the link, the menu folds out, but if you follow the event cascade, you get a mouse over first, menu folds out, then you get a click event and the link is followed. And that's not what they wanted. Still, the question remains, why do all other browsers not implement this? As to the on-mouse move, it seems that there are sites around that do something similar on mouse move. I've never personally seen one, but I've heard somebody talk about it. So this is second-hand information, but it's supposed to be also a problem. Oh yeah, this is the cascade that you get. After here, it just stops.
If something changes on the mouse over, will the mouse move event still fire?
I don't think it will, but I'm not 100% sure. But in practice, there are not that many scripts that listen to both mouse over and mouse move, I would say. So, the more important question is, what's a content change? It turns out, weirdly, that they mean a DOM change done through actual DOM methods, such as append child. And that an inner HTML change does not count. Why? I have no clue. Also, there's the question of styles. Does a style change, such as setting display block to none or vice versa, count as a content change? As far as I know, but I haven't tested this very much, display block to none does, and most other styles don't really. But again, I'm a bit guessing here because it was only fairly recently that I figured out that I had to test all of this with a lot of different CSS declarations, and I haven't actually done so yet. So, it's weird. It's kind of understandable, but I still wonder why other browsers didn't implement this. Okay, so we have touch events, we have mouse events, we have key events. What we are doing right now in practice is saying that each, what I call an interaction mode, touch, mouse or keys, has separate events. Right? We have the keyboard events, the mouse events and the touch events, and right now they are completely separate. We have to repeat these mouse events on the touch action, but that's for backward compatibility. Officially, if you look at it purely, a touch action should only cause touch events and not mouse events. But does this need to be the case? Do we actually have to separate out our events according to interaction mode? It would be strange, you know, if we would need a separate event for separate interaction mode on every single device. This one, that one, it kind of makes sense. This one, I don't know. It's a fun party game, actually. If you're drunk and you want to play a game, just invent new JavaScript events for new devices. It can be quite fun, actually. But the fundamental question is, do we constantly need to create more events when we think up a new interaction mode? For instance, doing something with the remote. In practice, right now, you use the D-pad, right, the arrows, and they behave as if they're arrow keys, which kind of totally makes sense. But so, and then the question becomes, do we count a TV remote as a separate interaction mode? Because you use it somewhat differently than the keyboard. And I don't have an answer to that, it's something you should think about. The connect is also an interesting one, right? You move kind of the cursor around with gestures. Right now, from a simple technical perspective, it's a cursor, so it's kind of like a mouse, which, as far as I know, is how the Connect handles events right now. But you could say that, yeah, maybe you could think up more complicated gestures, like this for zooming or whatever. Does it still, will it become a separate interaction mode, yes or no? And if so, do we need separate events for that? So, this is a philosophical question that you should think about. There is no right or wrong answer. It's just one of those things that once you spend 10 minutes and thought about it, it will expand your understanding of web development. So far the answer has been yes, we absolutely do need separate events for the separate interaction modes. But Microsoft disagreed. And here we come to the pointer events. Because what Microsoft said, yeah, you know, mouse and touch, in many cases, they're pretty much the same, such as in drag and drop, right? In drag and drop, the mouse and the touch events are just completely the same because the interaction is the same. So they said, okay, we're going to unite them. We're going to make pointer events which combine mouse and touch. I think this is an interesting proposal. From a purely practical perspective, this is the only thing that IE supports. So if you want touch-like events on IE, you have to use the pointer events. There's just no way of helping it. So, but that should not bind us to the underlying philosophical idea, which says, yeah, do we really need separate events for separate interaction modes? Do we need separate mouse and touch events? Sometimes the answer is yes. So they built in a way of figuring out what kind of interaction modes the user is using. So you can read out the pointer type, it's called. It can be mouse or touch, or even pen or stylus. And you know, some old Microsoft devices used a stylus for the main interaction. It never became very popular. But what you could also use is, for instance, a Wacom tablet with pens. And the Microsoft pointer events actually react to that, and you can actually read out the tilt of the pen or something like that, which could be interesting to graphic designers. So, in any case, Microsoft is making an interesting philosophical point here. To the point even that they have submitted this as a draft specification to the W3C. And what seems to be happening now is that W3C at least is convinced that pointer events are the way forward and not touch events. There are some patent issues in the background with Apple and so on, though the touch events themselves are not patented. There is, I don't know. I mean, I don't really like patents, so I never study them. But there seems to be something going on in the background. We are going to study a drag and drop example. The classic drag and drop works with mouse down, mouse move, mouse up, right? Without any changes, this will not work on a touchscreen because mouse down, mouse move, and mouse up all fire in the same event cascade that you get when you tap one time. So you have to change the script. Fortunately, it's really easy for touch events, but it's more complicated for pointer events. So this is a classical drag and drop. Right on mouse down, we initialize the lot. On mouse move, we follow the mouse with the drag layer, and on mouse up, we cancel it and we drop it wherever it is right now. We have touch events. Here you go. This works. Except for one little thing that we'll get back to, it's reading out the event coordinates. But that's pretty simple, but you need to know one trick. If you do this, it will just work. Again, this is because drag and drop resembles, mouse drag and drop resembles touch drag and drop so much, right? If you would do this for a drop-down menu, it would not work. But for drag and drop, it does. Okay, so what if we would just add the Microsoft functions? This is still prefixed MS pointer down. That's required for IE10. IE11 also supports the unprefixed versions. Anyway, it turns out that this does not work. At least not as you would expect. Why not? Because you have to learn a bit about working with the Microsoft events. Because they also have added one CSS property, MS touch action none. Again, prefixed in IE10, IE11 supports both the prefixed and the unprefixed version. What does this mean? It means you tell the browser, dear browser, you will handle no touch actions. The script will handle it all. And I used to not like this, but the Microsoft team has convinced me it's a good idea, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But I first want to show you, wait a minute, this is not, yeah, here are the values. What the value is saying is which action should be performed by the operating system. So if you say pan X, then the pan X action should be handled by the operating system, and everything else will be handled by your script. Which means that touch action none is actually dangerous. If you set it to your entire page, that page will not respond to any touch action anymore. And that's okay if you want to create a very complicated JavaScript library that kind of takes over, but in general you don't want that. So my general advice is to pick those values that you need and not use none. Notice the manipulation value. It means everything except double tap. And that is basically done in order to remove the 300 millisecond delay. Because if you just suppress the double tap, then the 300 millisecond delay is not necessary anymore. So the IE way of suppressing the delay is touch action manipulation. Okay. When I discovered this, I was not happy. because I had the feeling that they were mixing the CSS presentation layer and the JavaScript behavior layer. Touch events and pointer events clearly belong in the JavaScript behavior layer, and CSS should not interfere with that. However, what they said, and it kind of makes sense, is that traditionally, in order to, suppose you want a scroll action to be cancelled, right? The browser should not react to that scroll action. Now, the traditional way of doing that, and the way that works with the touch events, is executing a JavaScript function and then at the end saying prevent default, which is the standard way of saying this action should not perform its default action, right? It's the same with form submission, with clicking on the link. If you say prevent default, the link is not followed and the form is not submitted. So this works with the touch events. However, what they say is, yeah, okay, we could do that and it would work, but it might take a little time. Because your JavaScript function could be really, really complicated and take a few hundred milliseconds to run, and might want to read out all kinds of stuff that make it even slower, which would mean that you would scroll a little bit, and then the prevent default would kick in, and you would stop scrolling, and that does not make sense. Something should either scroll or not scroll. And that's why they said, okay, it's better to actually use a declarative CSS declaration that just tells the browser what to do and what not to do. And that kind of makes sense to me. I mean, it's just different from what we are used to. It's just different from JavaScript development as a whole, but it kind of makes sense to me. You just tell the browser in advance which actions you or your script is going to handle. So that's what we're doing here. And in order to properly use the pointer events, a touch action value is pretty much necessary. Again, use none with great caution. Pick the ones you want. By the way, you can combine them. You can say touch action pan X pinch zoom, so that pan X and pinch zoom are handled by the device and everything else by your script. So I kind of feel myself intrigued by this Microsoft idea. So does Google, because Chrome is actually implementing touch action. As far as I know, it's still behind a flag, but it's coming. So the Google guys are also seeing the benefits of this approach. Oh, and here's an example page with all the MS Touch Action values. You have to try this one on a Windows phone. I'm going to pass one. You could also pass your Windows phone on when you're done testing. And maybe on the tablet, let's try. These are just all the values that are available, just try them. While I get a glass of water. And in the end, finding the right value is just a matter of getting an IE on a touchscreen device and testing the various values. It's not that difficult. Yeah, okay, this is an old example. Let's talk a little bit about hover, because somebody already asked. The fundamental problem with hover is that it does not work on a touchscreen. You know, with a mouse cursor being permanently available on a regular desktop computer, it's fairly easy to say, okay, the mouse cursor is now over something, and we should react to that fact. The point is that a mouse cursor is continuous. That is, if we want to go from A to B, you have to move the cursor all the way and pass all the intervening elements. And touch actions, however, are discontinuous. You touch here, and then you touch there, and there's nothing happens in the intervening space. Which is again more like a philosophical point, like this is something we should all care about. On a more practical level, how would you have hover implemented on a touchscreen? Because the idea would be, okay, I touch the device, but that's already a touch action, right? If you touch a link, you follow the link. And you don't want a hover effect. I mean, it would be totally ridiculous to say, I touch the link, now I get the hover effect, and I touch it again, and I follow it. That would be completely strange. So the question is, how would you actually implement hover? Now, it's interesting that Samsung Galaxy S4 has a kind of a native hover. No, it doesn't work here. I'll pass it around. The problem is that it only works in its default browser, because this is a device function and not a browser function. You have to turn it on explicitly, but then when you hover your mouse over the screen without actually touching it, you see, well, just look for yourself. Yeah. Oh, okay. So, and the question is, of course, A, does it make sense? You will have to judge that for yourself when you get the S4. And B, should this also go for CSS-based hovers? So far, in practice, it does not. It does not trigger CSS hover classes, pseudo-classes in any way. And should it? Because this is the problem. We have no equivalent events on in the touch interaction for mouse over and mouse out, because it just doesn't make sense. You get example here 2, the drop-down menu 2, and I have to think. Oh yeah, what I did here was replace mouse over and mouse out by touch start and touch end. And as you will see, that makes absolutely no sense. It's the closest we can come to kind of mouse over, mouse out, but it doesn't actually work. So this is just to show you that it cannot be done. My conclusion so far is that there is no hover and touchscreen devices. And if you think about what does a hover really mean to you, I don't know about you, but when I come to a new unfamiliar site and I see a bunch of little texts at the left, I always go over it with my mouse. And if they change color, I know, that's the main navigation. And that's kind of useful, that effect. And people, ordinary consumers have learned to rely on it. So it would be a pity if we'd lose that, yes.
I've seen some examples where you implement the mouse power on the desktop and open the same application on mobile touch device. On a single tap, it behaves like mouse power. On double tap, it actually opens the link. Let's say you have a link that has two behaviors, two events, like
Okay.
mouse power and then touch and then click. Take that over to touch, load it to device. And single tap, it behaves like power, and double tap behaves like the click.
Okay, and do you think it works well? I mean, purely for you as a user, not as a web developer. I mean, as a user, do you like it or not?
Well, I've seen examples where it's kind of a heat map. Someone designed a heat map with a lot of data. And then you go on the hover on the section of the heat map shows some data. And then you click on it, and it actually gives you more detailed information about it. I think it's not bad. I mean, it's usable, but it's not intuitive. I mean, you go to the touch.
Exactly.
I mean, you won't right away get that there are two events.
Okay. So I think this is the least bad solution we can think up for the hover. I personally don't much like it, but maybe that's just a personal preference. I mean, it would be interesting to actually see some user data on that, usability research or something.
So on that question, is that the touch browser's default behavior to behave like that, or someone has actually implemented to prevent the default and act like that, make it act like that?
No, all the touch-based browsers do the event cascade that I showed earlier. So the natural way that the hover styles work on touchscreens is now you touch the element and the hover styles are set, you touch something else and the hover styles are removed. That's general. So in your case, I mean, they've written an entire script that makes sure that it works like that, and you can do that, of course. Technically, there's no problem, but I'm wondering about the usability, but maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. This is, again, when I wrote this presentation, I was very strict about no hover, it just doesn't exist, too bad. I don't know anymore. I mean, especially the Samsung device that you have seen or you will shortly see, it's kind of interesting what they do, but first of all, of course, the actual device would have to support this, right? Detecting the finger while it hovers above the screen. And besides, what you will see in the Samsung is that the zoomed in part is well above your finger, as it should be, because if we would implement hover like this, the hover styles may be applied, but your finger is on top of it, so you don't see it. So that's another problem, why I think that hover is just not very suited to mobile sites, to touch sites, I should say. And that again brings us to the fact that mobile can be used as a kind of a crowbar to get rid of old and bad interaction ideas. For instance, a very common one is, okay, you have this large data table and the designer has designed it and the front-end programmer has implemented it, and then the client comes around and says, yeah, we should kind of add one more column to this table. And there's really, really no space anymore, even on 1024 pixels. So they say, okay, we'll make it a mouse over effect. As far as I can see, that is kind of lazy. That's kind of, yeah, you know, we don't know what else to do, so we'll put a mouse over on it. And you see that a lot in many sites. And it's exactly that effect that just doesn't work on touchscreen browsers. So I'm kind of happy with the fact that using hover has become much more difficult and you really have to think about it. But again, if you think you have a good use case for hover, by all means try it. I mean, I'm not, while I was writing this presentation, I thought, okay, you should never use it, but maybe you should, but in tightly controlled circumstances. Yeah. Okay. There's one technical difference you should know about between the touch events on the one hand and all traditional events plus the pointer events on the other hand. And that has to do with event properties, right? We can read out interesting stuff about the event, and this is the very traditional way of doing that. Here's the event object, and we can read out the type, and the event target, and the event coordinates, except that these coordinates do not work for touch events. Why not? Because Apple has devised a slightly different system that kind of makes sense. What they say is, okay, oh wait a minute, I'll show this again. No, here. This event object contains 3 arrays with all currently available touches in them. What does that mean? There's a touches array and it contains all current touches. So if I touch the screen with 5 fingers, then the touches array will have 5 members, 1 for each finger. Which kind of makes sense. Then we have the changed touches array, which is all current touches that have fired an event. In other words, if I have 5 fingers on the screen, touches contains 5, but now I move one of these fingers, and change touches contains only one single member, namely that finger. Because this finger fires a touch move event, that touch move event says, okay, change touches, there's only one that's changing. If you would move 2 fingers, in theory it would have 2 members. Finally, there's target touches, and that is all the touch actions that are currently taking place on a specific target. So if I have 5 fingers on the screen, and these 2 are on one element, then target touches will have 2 members. Okay, which of them should you use? As far as I'm concerned, change touches is the best because of touch end. You release the screen with your last finger. And this is particularly important for drag and drops, right? At the moment you release the screen, you have to figure out, okay, where is the element right now? Is it a valid drop target? If yes, do something. If no, do something else. In any case, it's a pretty important event. At the moment, the last finger leaves the screen, touches and target touches are empty, because there are no more fingers on the screen. Change touches, however, still contains a reference to the finger that was just removed. And that's exactly the information you need. So, as far as I know, there's no drawback to using changed touches. So my general advice to you is to always use changed touches. And this is the way of getting the coordinates of the event. You have to go to a change touches member, which is basically the first, because in general you handle only one event at a time. So change touches has only one member and you access that member. This change touches 0 is the first one. And you return its client X and client Y. It's very simple. The coordinates have been moved from the event object to these touch array objects. And that's really all there is to it. They're just in a different place and you have to look there. However, the Microsoft model disagrees. Here, the client X and client Y, the coordinates are still on the individual pointer events. The touches array don't exist. I'm not sure about this anymore, so I'm not going to go into that. Which is basically why we need this function. This function will solve all your problems for you. If change touches exists at all, in other words, if we are using the touch events, then read out the currently changed touch, which is the touch you want to know something about. And if not, that is to say, if we have pointer events or old-fashioned mouse events, we just use the event object itself. And we get client X and client Y. Incidentally, client X and client Y are relative to the visual viewport. Page X and page Y are relative to the layout viewport. As far as I know, that works in all browsers. And it depends on your exact use case which of the two you have to use. There are a few things to be said about the touch move event. Suppose this Li is an element and I've got a touch move event handler. I touch it, I move, and of course touch move fires. Now I leave the Li, and the curious thing is that touch move continues firing. In other words, what counts is where the touch action started, not where it currently is. Microsoft's pointer move, on the other hand, if I have a pointer move event and I move out of the element, pointer move stops. Which is more in line with how mouse move works, right? I mean, because if you would do all this with a mouse and you would assign a mouse move event handler, then it would just fire only as long as you're on this element. So the touch events are the exception here. Again, I'm not 100% sure why they did this, but it might make sense in certain situations. I've created a test for that with the traditional and the Microsoft Move events so that you can see what's going on. Yeah, then we have the complicated topic of gesture events. Okay, I don't understand why I use this bridge. A gesture event is defined as a coordinated action of 2 or more touches. Pinch zoom is the best example. If you do pinch zoom, you have 2 separate touch events, right? Touch start, touch move for the 2 fingers. And in addition, you have 1 gesture event for the 2 fingers combined. Apple in Safari, and only Apple in Safari, offers special gesture start, gesture change, and gesture end events. And they fire when a gesture takes place. What?
The Windows one, is that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a Windows 5. Oh. Then I have to charge it. No. It was a pretty low battery. So, these events have not been copied by any other browser. I mean, Apple invented the touch events, right? And all the other touch browsers said, yeah, we need them as well, and we implement them, done. That did not happen here. I'm not totally sure why, but I see two potential reasons. First of all, again, patents. I once stumbled up on the actual Apple patents surrounding touch events, and from reading it, I'm not a lawyer, but from reading it, I got the idea that they were not talking about the touch events as such, but about the gesture events. So it could be that that's one of the reasons. The other reason it's not implemented is that these events aren't all that useful. I mean, you have plenty of libraries nowadays which try to figure out what kind of gesture a user is making, right? So if it's a pin zoom or a rotation or whatever, and they try to figure that out and give you information about that. In order to do that, you do not need the gesture events, because you are going to follow the touch events and figure out their coordinates, compare their coordinates to certain use cases you have in mind, etc., etc. And in order to do that, you can just use the touch events, and you don't need the gesture events. Microsoft has a lot of extra events. These are not part of the W3C specification, as far as I know, the gesture events. They could be kind of useful, and Microsoft is definitely pushing them. I yet have to be convinced of their usefulness. But I saw the first practical example only a week ago, so I'm still thinking about that. Gesture start, gesture change, gesture end, just like Apple. Gesture tap, this is a tap. Is that useful? Possibly. Gesture hold, which means I touch the screen and hold my finger in place. Useful? Possibly. Content zoom. I love content zoom. I think we should have a zoom event in JavaScript. I think we should know when the user zooms in or out. Microsoft tries to provide it. Unfortunately, they don't really work. Well, they do, but kind of complicatedly. If you want to use this event or any of the other events you saw just now, this is not enough. What you have to do is first of all create a new gesture object, assign the element as target to the gesture object, and then add a pointer. The Microsoft guy explained to me why this was the case. He may have a point, and I have to look at this more carefully, but I still don't like the code. I mean, it's a lot of code, right? While on the Apple side of things, on gesture chart just works. And the idea was that suppose you have a drawing application in IE, and you have 2 times 2 fingers, and they should all draw a line in separate elements, then you have to be able to distinguish, they are rotating. You have to be able to distinguish between this set of 2 touch pointer events and this set of 2 pointer events. And this is somehow supposed to do that. You will notice that I'm pretty vague here because I don't really understand it myself yet. But this is again something I have to look into. I thought it was just a lot of craft code added for no good reason. That turns out not entirely to be the case. But you need all of this in order to get the Microsoft gesture events to work. I'll post these slides online so you will be able to look it up. And of course, touch action. We shouldn't forget that one. And even when you do all that, content zoom doesn't work. That's such a pity. I really think we need a zoom event. I've created a test page, but one of the 2 doesn't actually work. That is, it gives the 404. We have reached the end of my touch events presentation. I hope you learned something. Again, in my book, there's an entire chapter devoted to the touch and the pointer events, and I'm going to add all the stuff I heard at Microsoft to that chapter, so you'll be able to read it, and I will have a little more time to think about it. Are there any questions about touch events? No? Cool. Is it right that this workshop stops at 4 and not at 5? Yeah. Let's see, what else do we have to do? Oh yeah. I am going to talk about setting up a device lab, but that will not fill 75 minutes. Do you have any general questions about mobile? Yes.
Question about scroll events on mobile?
Yeah.
They don't seem to happen while you're scrolling.
No, that is correct.
Do you think that that will change, or is that by design it will stay?
I think it's by design. Because scroll and also the resize event, you have two options. Either you fire it all the time while a scroll or a resize is going on, but that may take up a lot of memory and battery life because you fire the event over and over and over again, which is why more and more browsers opt for firing it only once when the scroll action or the resize action stops. So I think that's not going to change.
I noticed even if you have your own, like say you're using the, say you had your own timer going and you wanted to check the current offset at some time to see where you're at, even that, the value is not updated.
No, because as I know for sure that Safari suspends all JavaScript while scrolling or pinch zooming or something if it's going on. And I'm not too sure about the other browsers. I would not be entirely surprised if they did the same, because it just gets computationally too expensive for the processor and the memory and the battery. So you cannot do, it's safest to assume that you cannot do anything while the user is performing an action, like scroll, zoom, resize, whatever.
It stops media too. Like,
Excuse me?
it stops media too when you scroll.
Yeah.
It gives the
Yeah.
media.
Yeah, true. True. It's just too, because what you would have to do is, suppose you have a page with a video and you scroll that page. That would mean that the video would have to continue to run while scrolling. And that's just way too computationally expensive for mobile devices. It all comes back to the fact that what we have here is a processor that's terribly old-fashioned by desktop standards. That means that it just can't do certain things. Another good example is CSS transitions and animations and transforms. You will occasionally find that they don't work all that well on a certain phone, and that's a huge problem because you can't actually feature detect, hey, does this browser support transitions or animations, because the browser will say, yes, I do, because they actually support them. It's just that on this particular platform, it doesn't perform too well. For instance, because there is no direct connection with the GPU, right? Hardware acceleration is now all about talking directly from the browser to the graphics layer. And if that connection is not actually there, or if the GPU is slow, then you can run into issues that are just undetectable by any feature detection, and you have to resort to a browser detect. Yeah, let's talk a bit about browser detection, because we've always said that browser detection is evil, right? You've heard that, right? Browser detection is the evilest of evil, and you should always do a feature detection. I have been saying that for about 15 years now. However, it turns out that on mobile it's not so simple. The animation example is one example, right? Sometimes you have to turn off your animation in certain browsers because it just doesn't work too well. Another example is, for instance, the existence of a back button. Many websites or web apps have a back button somewhere here, because that's the iOS default. On Android that doesn't make sense because we have a back button here. How do you deal with that. It's something that's very hard to detect. Well, you could detect, is this an Android browser? But that's about it. There is no way of feature detecting a back button, because the browser has no clue that there is a back button or there is no back button. There is no simple yes or no value somewhere hidden deep within the browser. So you have to actually browser detect.
What's the use case behind detecting the back button?
That you don't have to show the back button in your own application. That you can just wait for the user to use the default back button. Which kind of makes sense. I mean, I'm using what's a feed bin for my RSS reader, right? I constantly keep forgetting that they have a back button here at the top left. I just press my hardware back button. I would like them to solve that. I would like them to also listen to the hardware back button, because in this particular case it's just a simple hash change and you change the page again, blah blah blah, but they don't actually do that. But in more complicated cases it would be sometimes useful to detect browsers in order to figure out that the device has a back button. So what we're seeing here is that old established truths are not quite true anymore. I mean, it was really interesting for me to see. I went into mobile based on my desktop experience, and the more I talked to people who had been working in mobile for a long time, the more I heard, yeah, sometimes the browser detection is inevitable. And I'm not saying that all of you should immediately start to detect all browsers and base all your decisions on that, but I am saying that sometimes it is the only possibility. And that it sadly sometimes makes sense. Also, if you decide to go that way, don't write your own, because there are more browsers than you or I have ever heard of. Use one of these two. Forget if it's Ruefel.com or .something else. Wow. What? No, I don't want to go here. What are you doing? I wanted to do a search. Thank you so much. This is Ruefel. It's generally considered one of the best. Basically, this is a database. You feed it a user-agent string and it gives you back all kinds of interesting information about the device. I'll enlarge this for you. And you can kind of buy that database to run it on your own site. Maybe they also offer a service. I'm not 100% sure. I think they do actually nowadays.
So you can download it locally, so you don't have to make the API request, or you can just make it.
Yeah. And that's the one, and the other one is Device Atlas. And that's basically another option. And let me see if they offer browser. Yeah, this is definitely also a service. I think they also offer a database. In any case, my point is, do not try to write this yourself, because you will go mad. 5 years ago, I did some work for Vodafone in Germany. I happened to be in their office on the very day that they discovered that Sony Ericsson had changed their UA strings from Sony Ericsson to Sony Space Ericsson. I learned a lot about German cursing that day. It was, I mean, everything broke, basically, because they did a little bit too much browser detection. But still, if you use a service, it could be that that service catches those problems for you. While if you do it yourself, you will have to be constantly updating and refreshing your browser detect. Because every single time a new device comes out, first of all you have to test it and figure out, okay, where do I want this device to end up? And then it may be that there's something weird in the browser string so that it doesn't quite follow the patterns that you've used so far, etc., etc. It's a lot of work, and I advise you not to do it. I advise you to use Whirlpool or Device Atlas instead. Which brings me to the kind of opposite case, and that is JavaScript libraries. I must admit I have never liked JavaScript libraries. Back in the starting years, back in 2005, 2006, I already said, guys, is this really the way to go? And everybody said, yeah, it is. So I said, okay, go ahead. But mobile made me reconsider. About 2 years ago, there was an experiment done by some scientists. They took an Android phone. They made sure they could measure its battery consumption, and then they went to the Wikipedia mobile site, and they measured that. Then they made a local copy of that specific page, and they removed jQuery from the Wikipedia site, because jQuery on the Wikipedia site, on the mobile version at least, is used only to show and hide certain elements, right? On the mobile site you get like history and this and that, and you can open or close them. In order to get that effect, they use jQuery mobile. So these guys wrote a simple 5-line custom script for that, measured the battery consumption again. It turned out it fell by 1/3. 33% of the battery consumption for loading and rendering that page was taken on by jQuery. And that's not because of the downloading of jQuery, because from the start the JavaScript library makers have seen very clearly that they shouldn't make their files too large. So the file size is okay, the downloading is okay, that's not a problem. It's the actual initialization of jQuery. Because jQuery just starts with initializing itself, you know, and creating all the special objects and the chaining and this and that, plus whatever the web developer has installed for modules and that kind of stuff. And that takes a lot of time. And you have to ask yourself, is this worth it? Now, if you have a very complicated interface with a lot of things going on, yeah, then it could definitely be worth it. But what I'm seeing far too often is that people just use JavaScript libraries because they don't actually understand JavaScript anymore. But I'm terribly old-fashioned in that regard. I mean, I still think that everybody who calls him or herself a web developer should just learn at least some pure JavaScript without libraries. And the worst is, of course, if you include 3 or 4 libraries in your page. You know, because you want this effect from that library, and this effect from that library, and this effect from that library, and that totally does not make any sense whatsoever. So I would urge you to, especially if you have simple effects, to just write your JavaScript yourself. Sure, the first time it will cost you more time, but in the long term it will teach you more about JavaScript in addition to making a better mobile site. Was a question? No? Okay. So that was my rant about JavaScript libraries. Let me see, it's close to 3 now. Let's take a short break, and then we will see how we fill the last hour, because I've run through my material, but I'm hoping you have questions, because that would be cool.
We try implementing an actual mobile app, like a simple mobile app.
A simple what?
We try implementing a simple mobile web app with the viewports and stuff. Just to make sure that we've got like everything correct, and give an example to like.
Yeah, that would be a good idea. Oh, do you want to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. It's like sounds like a great idea. I mean, I kind of assume who here has never used responsive design yet? Okay, everybody thought as much. But yeah, let's try something like that. I mean, it's probably the time to do something useful and creative and kind of get the juices flowing. Also because my voice is getting tired and I've talked all the time. So let's take a little break. Think about what you would like to do next. Think about if you have any more questions for me, and we could maybe create a little test application, something like just to get the feel of what you're actually doing with viewports, Dutch events, and all that. Break. Here is my basic advice on setting up a device lab. How many of you are freelancers? Who is a freelancer? Nobody. Oh, okay. I had kind of expected a few freelancers, but because it's freelancers that complain most about the first item. And this advice is geared toward freelancers because they have to save up some extra money in order to buy phones. You probably have an iPhone or an Android for yourself. Add the other one, if you know what I mean. I mean, go to your boss and beg or threaten or do whatever you need in order to get some budget for devices because you're going to need them. How many of you regularly test on a mobile device during website creation? Okay, several of you. How many of you regularly test on 3 or more mobile devices? Okay, 5 or more? 7? Okay. Okay, I've got 35, which is a bit extreme, but in general I would say that you need an iPhone, a BlackBerry, a Windows Phone, possibly also something old. What I plan to do is somehow get devices from India or China or something that are really cheap phones with either Opera Mini or UC Mini. But that's maybe not so important if you focus solely on the US. And Android specifically I want to talk about because, as I said, basically the default browser for every Android vendor is different. So you have to have a Samsung, maybe even 2 Samsungs, a high-end and a mid-range one, because Samsung is the most popular brand. HTC, excuse me, HTC, Sony, Motorola, LG, and I think that's mostly it for the US market. Make sure that every single device is from a different vendor, has a different screen resolution, has a different Android version, and you will do pretty well. You have, I mean, I already talked about how Chrome may be in danger of splitting up. We have to follow that. We have to figure out what's going on. You certainly want to follow if anything new happens to Android WebKit, the old default browser, but I don't think anything will, but you still will have to test on a lot of different devices. You can swap devices with other companies if you want to. I mean, it makes more sense for 2 small companies to combine and each buy 6 devices and regularly borrow the 6 from the other company. Open device labs are interesting. It's kind of spreading around the world. It's basically the idea of typically a small web development company has, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 devices, and they say, okay, you can come by and test on these devices, provided you reserve a space first. That's the basic idea, and then you're allowed to play with devices. And the fun thing about open device labs is you never know what you're going to get. It could be that there's a really, really obscure Android that handles your site really badly. And that's kind of fun to find out. And you can test, you can also test in shops and stores, because here in the US the phones are usually on, so you can actually go to them and test them. And that's kind of a guerrilla testing that I rather like. So let's put it like this. How many devices does your company have lying around that you can use in your daily work? Anyone?
I have about 20.
20. Anyone else?
Probably 6.
6.
I think about 2 dozen.
2 dozen. Okay? Okay, who has no mobile phones whatsoever to test on? Okay, you all have something at least. Oh, it's your personal phone or so. Okay, except for your personal phone, who has no mobile devices whatsoever to test on? Oh, okay. So basically what I'm seeing here is that nearly all of you work at companies that have at least seen that they have to do something with mobile. Basically it's just asking your boss for a budget. And that will probably, I guess, depend on that one client saying, hey, yeah, I absolutely want this to work well on mobile phones as well. Once you encounter such a client, use it to get your boss to spring you, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 devices. Or maybe 2 times 3, something like that. Because it's really important to have a good device lab around. Finally, I got a question about TVs and related stuff. I have been talking to a British guy called Patrick Lauke. He used to work for Opera, he doesn't anymore. And he's done some work, especially on the Opera TV browser. And from it he saw that TV browsers are making a crucial viewport mistake. And from somebody else I've heard that Google Glasses is making the same viewport mistake. And basically the mistake is making the ideal viewport too large. So what we have, this is actually a good example of a TV. I'm so sorry. A TV typically has 1920 pixels, device pixels on the device, but you will never want to see a website that's actually 1920 pixels wide on a TV because it would be far too small. This is not nice and readable. I mean, you're seeing it here. What I do is I zoom in considerably. So one of the things Patrick Lauke is saying is that TV browsers habitually make their ideal viewport too large. That they think, okay, we've got a lot of pixels, so let's throw all of that pixels at our websites, which doesn't make sense at all. The ideal viewport is partly dependent on the distance between yourself and the device. Now for phones and tablets, that's pretty much this, right? So phones and tablets, their ideal viewports are mostly about the device size. However, you're about 10 feet away from a TV, which means that you don't see small details all that well, and that you should try something. Go to home, sit on the sofa, watch your TV, and then put your phone in front of the TV, and you will see that your phone is actually larger than your TV. Not really, of course, but it covers more of your angle of sight than the TV. So that should be an argument in favor of making TV ideal viewports more like 500 to 600 pixels wide instead of, I don't know, they use far too large ones. I don't have any numbers available, but here Patrick Lauke was complaining that they were doing it wrong. And the same, there was an article a while ago, I think by Luke Wroblewski, but I'm not sure, about how Google Glasses did basically the same wrong. They used the iPad as a reference device. While it actually makes sense, I mean, I've never actually worn a Google Glass, so I'm not talking from experience, but it would actually make more sense to see it as kind of a TV as well, because if I understand correctly, they are pretending that the screen here is about 10 feet away from you. And that's, of course, with a lot of sleight of hand. But that would mean that they would also end up in the 500 to 600 range. I think that the fundamental issue here is that people think that more pixels equals a better user experience, which is absolutely not the case. Sometimes less pixels equal a better user experience. I also think that they are taking their cues from the physical width of the mobile device screen without contemplating the distance between your eyes and the device, because it's actually the angle of sight that's most important here. You have this takes up a certain angle of my view, and a TV takes up roughly the same. though it's of course in landscape mode, and maybe slightly larger, so it would make sense to make it about 500. In any case, this is probably something that's not going to be solved anytime soon, because the average TV browser vendor is not listening to anyone. It's mostly the big Asian companies, and the problem with the big Asian companies is that they don't listen to people. They are not interested in developers. Instead, developers should be interested in them, and they should kind of gratefully take whatever Samsung or HTC wants to hand out. Which is a DevRel proposition that's not going to work in the long run, but they will have to figure that out for themselves. So in general, you can say that ideal viewports on anything else than mobile devices or tablets are generally too wide. Which raises the question of what to do about it. Right now, I don't know. What could actually help us here is the initial scale equals 2 trick that we saw earlier. Right, that you make it zoom in to 200%, and that makes the viewport smaller. I don't know if that actually works on TV browsers because I've never tested it. But if it does, it could be possibly a solution. But then, how do you distinguish between a mobile browser or a tablet browser and a TV browser? Probably by browser detecting. Which reminds me of something else. Media queries have a media type, like all or screen or print or whatever. There exists a lot of media types for instance, TV or handheld, but in practice they're not supported. I'm not sure about TV, but I do know why handheld is not supported. The problem was that back 10 or 15 years ago, mobile browsers as they existed back then did support type equals handheld. But they were the old WAP browsers that kind of couldn't handle real HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but just WAP. As a result, web developers started to detect handheld and send inferior styles to those devices. Just very simple styles that they thought they could handle. You know, a bit of color, maybe a margin, that's about it. Along came the modern mobile browsers, and they could support real, genuine desktop websites, so they didn't want to be grouped with the old mobile browsers. So the simplest way of achieving that was dropping support of media type handheld. And that's what all of them did. That's why no current mobile browser supports media type equals handheld. And I've got the feeling that something similar is going on for TV. We are seeing here the eternal arms race of browser makers versus web developers. We saw that in the user agent strings. And you know, because back in the day, everybody detected IE, so you were IE or something else, and something else was either shoved away from the site altogether or got a vastly inferior experience. So other browsers had to pretend they were IE. Opera has always consistently done this. Every single Opera browser string you find out there has IE in it for this specific reason. So that's what I mean by the arms race, and this whole arms race will continue for as long as we web developers try to detect browsers for reasons that aren't good enough. I mean, there is a tension between what I'm saying now and what I said a half an hour ago about browser detection sometimes being good on mobile, and I totally acknowledge that, and I'm not sure where the truth lies here, but the problem is mostly that we web developers have used browser detection far too often, which has forced browsers to react, and it's typically the small browser that could actually handle your page really well, provided it got through the browser detect. So it's going to pretend to be something else. And we see that up to a point on mobile. We see that certainly with the media type handheld. We saw that on desktop, and it's going to happen many times over, which is why no detection method is ever safe. Because if it's safe for a moment, then you will use it to basically distinguish good from bad. and along will come something new that you detected as bad, but it's actually good, so it's going to change that again. And that is, I'm afraid that's going to continue for all of our lifetimes, because there is no fundamental solution to this problem. So that's a negative note to close off. I don't know. I think I'm done. I hope you learned something. I realized that I was a bit random in my presentations. I myself like that. Some of my attendees also like that. Others will hate it. So if you hate it, I'm so terribly sorry. But it's the way I give workshops. I mean, I just talk and talk and talk and talk about stuff. I think we can spend. Well, we officially still have at least half an hour. I think we can spend that doing something useful. Of course, if you have questions, I'd love to take them. Or we could work on some kind of a test app for viewports or for touch events. Are there any questions, first of all? Yes?
Have you had a lot of experience with Android virtual devices and how well they actually...
I do not. No, I have deliberately decided at a very early stage that I would not do simulators because there would basically be extra browsers. Because what you have to do in order to create a simulator is port your browser to Windows or Mac. And something in the porting can go wrong, and it will, may end up with a browser that's different than the original. Or I think they're porting all of Android nowadays to those simulators. Is that right?
Yeah, there's you essentially can create a VM of an Android phone.
Yeah.
I've noticed that they don't run quite as fast as the real.
No. Yeah, but I generally advise people not to use simulators at all. First of all, because of this problem, there may be a difference between the simulated browser and the actual browser. And secondly, because you have to hold the device in your hand. Because, with the back button at the top, for instance, one of my favorite examples, if you're a regular Android user like I am, you will disregard that button and automatically press the back button here. And you will only find that out by testing with a real device. And there's more subtle things like, are these links big enough? Or do I regularly tap on the wrong link? That sort of stuff. It can only be found out by testing on actual real devices. So I'm all in favor of testing real devices. And I have no experience with the simulator. You also had a question?
Yes, could you cover more about the orientation change? What is linked to...
Orientation change, yeah. That's very simple. I have to look up one detail because I forget. There is one browser incompatibility problem and I can find it here. Orientation change is very simple. The event fires whenever you change the orientation of the device, period. And I'm now going to look up, I think that the event is supported everywhere, but the media query isn't. No, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The orientation change event is supported only in WebKit and Blink-based browsers, not in IE or Firefox currently. I have no clue why. But this is landscape and this is portrait. However, you also have the orientation media query, which is supported in IE and Firefox as well as all the other browsers. And that's just orientation, landscape or portrait, which you can use safely. Now for an interesting cross-browser thing. I have my device like this, and I make this orientation change. Does it count as an orientation change or not? Different browsers give different answers. In practice, it doesn't matter all that much, but these are the for me these are the fun things of browser incompatibilities. Because once you think about it, I mean, yeah, the orientation kind of changes, but it goes from landscape to landscape. So should an event be fired? Those are the little things that make it fun. So the media query is supported by all browsers, and the event is only supported by WebKit and Blink-based browsers. Any more questions?
Is there any way to debug on Android devices?
As far as I know, there isn't. Does anyone have experience with debugging? Because that's one of the things on mobile that I have little experience with, because I'm so terribly old-fashioned, I still use alerts. You have?
What you can do is you can either use Chrome or you can use Safari for
But few of the defects occur only in the web view browser, not on the Chrome app. So there's a support that is called WEINRE. So yeah, that only has the CSS. You can only see the CSS stuff and not the JavaScript.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I think it might only be the latest version of Android. You can debug through the screen, even the web view, but I think it's only for Android 4.4.
Yeah. I don't know if you do that, but what I always do when I create a mobile application, I test it first in Chrome on desktop, just to see if there's any syntax errors or stuff like that, or easy to fix stuff. I mean, of course, it gets complicated if the bug only occurs on mobile. But work is being done on this, but I must admit I'm not up to speed with the current state of debuggers. So maybe somebody else has anything to add to this? New tools, new browsers that support debuggers. No, it remains a problem. Any more questions?
Sort of a curveball here. Have you done, in any of the viewport stuff that you've done, have you done any research on print?
On print?
Media query, and also as the viewport supports with landscape, portrait, and everything else?
No, I have not. I kind of always assumed that the ideal viewport would be defined by the paper. That the browser sees what kind of printer it has and then does some magic and it automatically gets right. But no, I have not. I've thought about it for a long time, but it would waste so much paper, because I would have to print out every single one of my tests in 5 browsers several times over to figure out what's going on.
Or you'd have a very large stack of PDF files.
Yeah, I could do that.
Quite the same.
No, it's true, but then I would assume that the PDF file exactly mirrors what comes out of the printer. And of course I'd have to test on several dozens of printers, because the HP with IE could have a bug that the brother with IE does not have. Well, you get the point. I mean, the biggest problem I'm facing in browser compatibility research is kind of limiting my research, because this simple example shows that there are so many factors involved that if you don't watch out, then you will have to run 600, 700, 800 to 1,000 tests on all kinds of different configurations, and I don't want to do that because I would go completely mad. So I tend to test very specific things, which means that, for instance, I know a lot about viewports but nothing about debugging. I know little about typography, but a lot about touch events. And I'm not saying that this is something you should emulate, because it's definitely not what you need as a regular web developer, but I've strayed considerably from the path of a regular web developer years ago, and I just now do browser research most of the time, which makes me kind of an oddity. But it's also fun, you know, to be just about the only guy in the world who does this, and be the go-to person for browser makers and so on. Any more questions? No? Okay. As far as I'm concerned, this workshop has ended now. Oh, you have a question? No.
Sorry, I wasn't really listening. Was your question about how to debug mobile console JavaScript?
Yeah.
There's something called the toolbar my colleague used. I haven't actually used it properly, but jsconsole.com. You can basically stream your console out from the mobile to desktop, so you can see the.
I think, but not for the native browser.
For the web view? No, yeah. You're working a lot in web views.
Yeah, because we don't want our customers to download Chrome. So most
Yeah.
of them don't download Chrome. They just use a native browser.
Yes, that is absolutely true. That's absolutely true. So it's, web views are an extra problem, because I get the feeling that nobody ever figured we needed to test them. So, but I'm not sure about that. I will probably have, I have, over the past 2 weeks, I have reluctantly come to the conclusion that I will have to spend some time in WebView testing, and I'm not at all looking forward to that, because there will be differences between this WebView and that WebView, and besides I need a kind of a browser app that will allow me to at least type in the URL and use the back button. Any more questions, remarks, other things? No? Then I think we're done here. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you learned a lot. Whatever. Take care and test on mobile browsers.